Harlem, early 1960s, when the streets had their own laws and the city pretended not to notice. Bumpy Johnson's name moved like weather. You couldn't see it, but you felt it in every doorway. Every number slip folded into a palm. Every landlord who suddenly found patience for late rent. Frank Lucas was still a man people underestimated. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, the kind of quiet that made loud men nervous. And before we step into this world, quick word. Timos Osanjo de Alcancar, 1,000 inscritos, 8, o final do MESSE, inscriva e deixo SCU, like e faca parte de Sanjo. Because this story is fictionalized, grounded in real figures and real Harlem truth, and you're part of what keeps these untold corners alive. The offer came in a place that didn't belong to anyone. A back booth in a midtown lounge where the music was too smooth for the conversations. The man across from Frank didn't introduce himself, because people like that never did. He slid a plain envelope across the table. Not money yet, just proof. A bank letter. A wire template. Names of accounts that looked like secrets. Then the number landed, soft as a napkin. $1 million if Frank would take Bumpy off the board. Not a street hit, not a sloppy spectacle. Something clean, something final, something that would let other men fill the vacuum. Frank didn't touch the envelope. He didn't need to. He'd already read the room the way he read corners. Exits, angles, who was watching, who was pretending not to. The man talked about business, about stability, about how Harlem could be managed if the old lion stopped breathing. Frank listened, because listening was how you survived. But under the table, his hand stayed open. No weapon, no twitch, just stillness. He asked one question that made the offer man blink. After he's gone, who do you think they'll blame first? Outside, the city was cold and bright, and Frank walked like he had nowhere to be. But his mind was already moving. 1 million wasn't a temptation, it was a test. If he took it, he'd be rich today and dead tomorrow, because Harlem didn't forgive betrayal dressed up as opportunity. Bumpy had built an empire on loyalty and fear, sure, but also on rules. And Frank understood something most men didn't. If you wanted to become the richest gangster in Harlem, you didn't start by killing the king. You started by learning how the crown stayed on his head. Frank went back uptown and did what smart men did when the world turned strange. He watched. For a week, he changed nothing. Same barbershop greetings, same late-night walks past the Apollo's glow, same quiet nods to men who never nodded first. He wanted to see if the offer had ripples. And it did. A familiar car started appearing on his block. A new face lingered too long outside a diner. A delivery guy asked questions that weren't about the package. Harlem was a chessboard, and somebody had moved a piece. He didn't run to Bumpy immediately. Running looked guilty. Instead, Frank set a trap made of normal life. He sent a friend to mention, casually, that Frank was thinking about going downtown more. Another friend said he'd heard Frank was tired of being under anyone. It was bait. Within 2 days, the Midtown man's messenger appeared again. This time not polite, not patient. He wanted a yes. He wanted proof Frank was the kind of man who could be bought. He wanted a timeline. Frank gave him something better, a lie that tasted like truth. He said he'd consider it, but he needed to know who was backing the money. Because if I'm taking a crown, he said, I want to know who's standing behind me when the crowd starts throwing stones. The messenger smirked like Frank was finally being sensible. And that smirk told Frank everything. These weren't Harlem men. These were outsiders, downtown suits, maybe connected to syndicates that saw Bumpy as an inconvenience, an independent power they couldn't fully tax. That night, Frank stood outside a brownstone where Bumpy held court without calling it court. Music drifted through the windows. Laughter, glasses, the soft confidence of people who believed they were protected. Frank didn't go in through the front like a kid asking for approval. He went in through the side, greeted the right guard, and waited until Bumpy was alone enough to hear something serious. When Bumpy finally looked at him, it wasn't warmth, it was assessment, the way a man looks at a blade to see if it's still sharp. Frank spoke plain. No drama. No hero speech. They offer me $1 million to kill you. The room went quiet in a way that swallowed sound. Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask how. He only asked one thing, slow and heavy. "And what did you say?" Frank held his gaze. "I said no," he answered. "Because if I'm going to die, it won't be for a stranger's money. And if I'm going to rise, it won't be by cutting my own foundation." Bumpy stared at Frank like he was reading a contract written in the air. Then he did something that confused everyone listening from the edges. He smiled just slightly. "A million," Bumpy repeated, tasting the number like it was whiskey. "That means I'm still worth something to people who don't even live here." He gestured for Frank to sit. No congratulations. No applause. In Bumpy's world, loyalty wasn't a poem. It was a currency, and right then, Frank had deposited something rare. Bumpy didn't tell Frank he was proud. He told him the truth. "You think they offered you money because they respect you?" Bumpy asked. "They offered it because they think you're hungry." Frank didn't deny it. Hunger was what brought him from North Carolina to New York, what kept him awake, what made him memorize the rhythms of power. Bumpy leaned in. "Good. Stay hungry. But aim it correctly. There's a difference between appetite and desperation. Desperate men do sloppy things. Hungry men do patient things." Over the next weeks, Bumpy quietly tightened his circle. Meetings moved. Routes shifted. Names changed. Harlem didn't see it because Harlem was used to motion. But the downtown pressure increased. A numbers runner got jumped. Nothing fatal, just a message bruised into skin. A bartender who owed protection money was suddenly pressured by new friends. It wasn't war yet. It was testing the fence to see where it broke. Bumpy understood the syndicate style. Squeeze until the independent man either pays, bends, or snaps. And then came the lesson that shaped Frank's entire future. Bumpy took him on a drive. Not flashy, not ceremonial. Just two men in a car, moving through neighborhoods that looked like they were made of grit and promise. Bumpy pointed out corners like they were investments. "See that storefront?" he said. "That's not a store. That's a ledger." He pointed to a church. "That's not religion. That's influence." He pointed to a block of apartments. "That's not housing. That's votes." Frank listened, and something clicked. Power wasn't only guns. Power was logistics. Power was supply. Power was making the city depend on you without realizing it. Before they returned, Bumpy parked and spoke like a father who didn't say son. "If you refused $1 million to kill me," he said, "you didn't just save my life. You bought your own future. But understand this. People who offer that kind of money don't take no like a gentleman. They take no like a challenge." Frank nodded, watching the streetlights flicker on. In his chest, fear tried to rise, then turned into focus. Because he understood now, the million wasn't the prize. The million was the doorway. And beyond it was a path to become something Harlem had never seen. The countermove wasn't a shootout. It was quieter and crueler in a business sense. Bumpy understood that outsiders thrived on predictability, so he removed it piece by piece. Drop times shifted without warning. Couriers rotated routes mid-run. Safe houses became temporary by design. Harlem didn't feel the change because Harlem was used to motion, but downtown men hate uncertainty. Frank was placed at the center of this living maze, learning how to keep the machine humming even while its parts refused to sit still. He learned that fear makes noise, but control whispers, and whispers last longer. When pressure failed, the outsiders attacked reputation. A rumor slid through the clubs that Frank was too close to Bumpy, that he was being groomed like a pet, that he'd never rise while the old lion breathed. The lie was clever because it wasn't entirely false. Frank didn't deny it publicly. He didn't puff his chest or issue threats. Instead, he did something dangerous. He made himself indispensable. He solved disputes before they spilled. He stabilized supply when others panicked. He paid on time, every time. Men who mocked him on Monday needed him by Friday. Respect didn't arrive as applause. It arrived as dependence. Then came the second offer, smaller, dirtier, delivered through a familiar face who pretended to be worried for Frank's future. "They're saying you missed your chance," the man whispered. "$1 million doesn't come twice." Frank smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. He understood now that refusing the first offer had made him visible. That visibility was leverage if handled right, and a death sentence if mishandled. So he let the rumor live just long enough to draw attention, then buried it under performance. Every successful week made the idea of killing Bumpy less profitable for everyone involved. Bumpy watched from a distance. That was the real test. He didn't shield Frank from danger. He measured how Frank moved through it. One night, after a dispute ended without blood and with money still flowing, Bumpy sent a simple message. Meet me. No praise. No ceremony. Just acknowledgement. In that room, Bumpy spoke the words Frank would remember forever. People think wealth comes from taking shortcuts, he said. But shortcuts make witnesses. What you're doing, this patience, this is how empires outlive their founders. Frank understood then that refusing $1 million wasn't a sacrifice. It was an investment, and the interest was compounding. By the mid-1960s, Harlem was changing, even if it didn't know it yet. The streets looked the same, but the currents underneath had shifted. Frank Lucas had become the man people called when something had to work. Not flashy, not loud, effective. While others chased headlines, Frank chased infrastructure. He studied how heroin moved, how money washed itself clean through clubs, barbershops, and legitimate storefronts, how silence could be purchased without a gun ever leaving its holster. The $1 million offer had taught him something crucial. Real wealth wasn't earned in a single violent act. It was built by controlling the flow no one else saw. The outsiders felt it first. Their profits thinned. Their contacts complained. Harlem wasn't hostile. It was uncooperative. Meetings got postponed. Agreements required intermediaries who answered to Frank before anyone else. The syndicate realized too late that while they were focused on removing Bumpy, a quieter succession plan had already begun forming beneath their feet. Frank wasn't trying to replace the king overnight. He was learning how to inherit an ecosystem without triggering a war. Violence still existed, but Frank treated it like a last resort, not a business model. When disputes erupted, he arrived with numbers, not threats. He paid debts that weren't his to pay, then collected favors that were his to collect. Men who once laughed at the idea of Frank as a power broker now found themselves asking permission without realizing it. That was the genius of it. Control disguised as cooperation. Authority hidden inside reliability. One evening, Bumpy called Frank to his side during a gathering that mattered. Old Harlem names were there, men who had survived by instinct and brutality. Bumpy didn't introduce Frank as a successor. He didn't need to. He simply deferred to him on a decision involving territory and money. The room noticed. Silence fell. In that silence, Frank felt the weight of everything he'd refused, every shortcut he hadn't taken. $1 million could have bought him a moment. What he was building now was buying him time. And in Harlem, time was the most dangerous currency of all. The year Bumpy Johnson died, Harlem didn't erupt. It inhaled. Power vacuums usually screamed with gunfire, but this one felt different, like a city holding its breath to see who understood the rules well enough not to break them. Frank Lucas understood them better than most. He didn't rush to claim anything. He attended the funeral quietly, stood where he was supposed to stand, spoke to who he was supposed to speak to, and left before emotion turned into opportunity for someone else. That restraint told the neighborhood everything it needed to know. The outsiders made their final mistake in that silence. Believing Harlem was leaderless, they pushed too hard. New demands, higher cuts, unfamiliar faces enforcing old agreements. Frank didn't confront them directly. Instead, he let their pressure expose them. Runners refused routes. Suppliers delayed shipments. Numbers came up short in places they'd never failed before. No speeches, no ultimatums. Just friction. Within weeks, the syndicate realized they weren't negotiating with a grieving community. They were negotiating with a system that had already reorganized itself. Frank stepped forward only when the outcome was inevitable. He didn't announce dominance. He demonstrated inevitability. He offered stability where chaos was brewing, consistency where fear had crept in. Men who once answered to Bumpy found that their calls were already being returned by Frank. Not because he demanded it, but because he solved problems before they became public. Violence still existed at the margins, but it was contained, disciplined, and rare. Harlem didn't become safer. It became managed. By the end of the year, the $1 million offer had become legend, retold in whispers, distorted by ego, exaggerated by envy. Some said Frank refused because he was loyal. Others said he refused because he was smart. The truth sat somewhere deeper. He refused because killing Bumpy would have made him rich once. Protecting the structure Bumpy built made him rich forever. By the time the city noticed Frank Lucas as a name worth fearing, the money was already flowing too fast and too quietly to stop. With Bumpy gone, Frank Lucas faced the most dangerous moment of any rising empire: success without applause. Harlem functioned, which meant the wrong people were losing money in ways that didn't look dramatic enough to justify a war, but hurt too much to ignore. Law enforcement pressure increased quietly. Not raids, not headlines, audits, surveillance, questions asked twice in rooms that smelled like coffee and patience. Frank responded the same way he always had, by becoming boring. He expanded legitimate fronts, cleaned cash through businesses that employed the neighborhood, and kept disputes small enough to solve with conversation instead of funerals. The real turning point came when a powerful Southern connection approached Frank with an offer that echoed the past. Bigger supply, purer product, less dependency on middlemen. It was risky, unprecedented, and potentially transformative. Frank remembered the $1 million envelope sliding across a table years earlier and recognized the same test wearing a different suit. He accepted, but on his terms. No intermediaries who didn't answer to him. No timelines he didn't control. No violence without consent. It wasn't bravado. It was architecture. For the first time, Frank wasn't inheriting a system. He was designing one. Money multiplied, not loudly, methodically. Harlem felt it in subtle ways. Bills paid on time, storefronts stabilized, families protected from the worst shocks of street chaos. Frank's wealth grew because his costs shrank. He avoided wars. He avoided betrayal. He avoided ego. While others chased dominance through fear, Frank chased dominance through dependency. The city didn't celebrate him. It leaned on him, and that was far more profitable. People still whispered about the million he'd refused. Some said he was foolish. Some said he was sentimental. But the older men, the ones who'd survived long enough to know better, understood the real lesson. Frank Lucas didn't become the richest gangster in Harlem by taking the biggest offer. He became the richest by refusing it, by choosing patience over spectacle, structure over shortcuts, and time over trophies. And time, in the end, paid him back with interest no envelope could ever hold. Years later, when Frank Lucas sat alone in rooms most men would never enter, the story of the $1 million offer still followed him like a shadow. It had grown in the telling. Sometimes the number was bigger, sometimes the danger sharper, but the core remained the same. A moment where one decision split two futures apart. Frank understood now that Harlem hadn't made him rich. Restraint had. The discipline to say no when yes would have been easier. The intelligence to see beyond a single payday into an entire lifetime of leverage. By then, Frank's operation had surpassed anything the outsiders once imagined. Supply moved with surgical precision. Money traveled cleaner, faster, quieter. Harlem wasn't just a territory. It was a fortress built on routines, loyalties, and invisible agreements. Frank rarely raised his voice. He rarely showed anger. His power lived in anticipation. People behaved correctly around him because they understood that chaos simply didn't work anymore. Violence still existed, but it was controlled, purposeful, and costly, used only when stability demanded it. Sometimes, late at night, Frank thought about Bumpy Johnson, not as a king, but as a lesson. Bumpy had taught Harlem how to stand on its own. Frank had learned how to make it profitable without breaking it. Killing Bumpy would have shattered the structure and left Frank standing alone on rubble. Protecting that structure had allowed him to climb without ever standing exposed. That was the difference between a gangster who flashes wealth and one who accumulates it. In the end, the $1 million offer became a warning whisper to ambitious men coming up behind him. Money can buy speed, but speed attracts attention. Power Real power moves slow enough to look harmless. Frank Lucas didn't become the richest gangster in Harlem by pulling trigger. He did it by understanding when not to. And in a city built on noise, that quiet decision echoed louder and longer than any gunshot ever could.